Is it wrong to tell a lie? What does it mean to say something is good? Where do moral values come from? So these are just some examples of ethical questions. Today, we're going to learn about ethics, specifically feminist ethics. Welcome to this lecture on the introduction of feminist philosophy. I'm Dr. Gina Opiniano, and I invite you to join me in exploring this area of feminist philosophy called feminist ethics. So ethics in Greek is ethos, which means norm or a standard pattern of behavior. Also known as moral philosophy, ethics is a system of moral principles, values, and theories, and sets out to understand and justify people's moral beliefs and the forms of life in which those beliefs are practiced or are carried out. So ethics has three branches. As an academic discipline, it can be divided into three branches. The first branch is metaethics, the study of what morality is. To engage in metaethics is to ask questions like, what do moral terms mean? Where do moral values come from? Do moral judgments consist of statements that must be either true or false? Or are they more like applause or an expression of disgust? So this is the first branch of ethics called meta-ethics. All right. Now the second branch is normative ethics. This is the study of moral theories and concepts. This is the practical task or the practical aspect of ethics, as they say. The task of normative ethics is to set out and critically examine the norms or standards that we can use both to guide and to evaluate our actions. It's here where we find moral theories such as the ethics of care, for example, social contract theory, utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, and virtue ethics. So you're doing normative ethics when you try to determine what duties you have to your parents or to other people, or whether you should forgive somebody who isn't sorry for having mistreated you. So that's the second branch of ethics. Now, the third one is called practical ethics. This is the study of ethical issues that arise within specific social practices. You will often hear this area or this part of ethics called applied ethics, because on one popular picture of morality, ethics at this level is already on the matter of taking the principles that you have logically deduced from your moral theory at the normative level and applying them to concrete cases. So this is the applied aspects of ethics. Now, what are some examples of practical ethics? We have legal ethics, also have medical ethics, let's say the ethics of journalism and business ethics, all of which set out to regulate the behavior of the people working on those specific fields. Aside from that, we also have environmental ethics and bioethics, the study of ethical issues that arise from these areas, for example, from the rapid advances of biomedicine. So here, this is where we also debate about issues of abortion, of academic freedom, issues of climate change, and physician-assisted suicide. All right, so these are some of the areas of ethics that we look into in the study of ethics. Now we realize, and this is probably apparent, that as human beings living in the world as rational beings, there are certain things that we must do and we must not do. That goes to say that there is an ethical dimension of human existence. So I started with that and would like now to proceed to the discussion points of today's lecture. Saan ngayon papasok ang feminist ethics? Where does feminist ethics come in? Among the three branches that I've talked about, feminist ethics isn't a branch of ethics, right? It's a way of doing ethics. Believers of feminist ethics called feminist ethicists would work on the interplay of these branches or on the application of a feminist perspective as far as these three branches of ethics are concerned. So the discussion that I'll be doing will look into the interplay of the so-called mainstream theories of ethics and explore how these and how ethics can be studied in a different lens. I will proceed by talking about some themes, the aims of feminist ethics, and I'll end with some schools of feminist ethics or varieties of feminist ethics. I'd like to say at this point that the lecture draws inspiration from the works of feminist ethics, Dr. Sarah Clark Miller and Dr. Hill Lindman. So now let's begin with some discussions on mainstream ethical theories. So when we talk about ethics, it's a subject that has historically presented this discipline as very male-centric, as philosophy is. So it has been a male-centric endeavor, and philosophers seem to have downplayed women to have a principled, educated thought. Now, feminist ethicists would explore themes which are previously or which are disregarded by these mainstream ethical theories or by these thinkers, such that by looking into these aspects of ethics, those that are not so explored by the mainstream theories, it helps us to pay close attention to some vulnerabilities, right? So when we talk about ethics, just to give the proper context, when we talk about ethics, we would probably almost always think about, for example, John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham for utilitarianism, the pioneers of utilitarianism. For Kantian ethics, we have Immanuel Kant, Kantian ethics also called the categorical imperative or the ontological theory. And of course, we have virtue ethics by Aristotle. So utilitarianism, which focuses on the consequence or the telos of an action, the determinant of the rightness or wrongness of the action is the telos or the consequence of the acts. And for Kantian ethics, it would focus on one's duty on in the specific scenario in an ethical situation. That's why it's called the duty-based or the rights-based theory. And for virtue ethics, it takes on the notion of virtue. It's often conceived as excellence as fundamental, so virtue as fundamental. Now, virtue ethics emphasizes on the role of the character of the individual and virtue as key elements of ethical thinking, as opposed to, or rather, or aside from consequences and some standards of morality, as the case for the first two theories of ethics. Now, the mainstream ethical theories are seen to have blind spots, especially in consideration of what I said to be vulnerabilities. And this is generally against the female sex. Now, one example that I can share would be the articulation of one of the most revered Enlightenment philosophers, also representing one ethical viewpoint of morality or theory of morality, Immanuel Kant. In his work, The Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, he said, and I quote, "It is difficult for me to believe that the fair sex," referring to the woman, "is capable of principles," end of quote. Furthermore, it's in the same work he also said, I quote, "The fair sex has just as much understanding as the male, only it is a beautiful understanding, while ours," referring to men, "should be a deeper understanding," which is an expression that means the same thing as the sublime. So from these statements, Kant seems to be saying that women are incapable of full active participation in public life, which means to say that if they're incapable of public life, they're incapable of being politicians, public officials, or even scholars, therefore relegating only women to some specific domestic duties. All right. So this is grounding on the premise that that women or the female sex are simply not in possession of the practical or the self-reflective reason such participation requires. So this is just a couple of many sexist remarks of earlier philosophers against women, and there's many others, but I'd like to focus just on a couple of examples to illustrate that indeed in the history of philosophy and ethics, this is how women are perceived, if at all are perceived positively. In fact, they are neglected. So what's the danger of this is that the thoughts of these luminaries or revered philosophers have stood as truths for quite a while, for so long, thereby resulting to the exclusion of women in the many facets of the public and the private spheres. So feminist ethics takes off from feminism. Feminist ethics comes in and argues that the world is male-oriented and it's devised by men and dominated on a male emphasis on systems of inflexible rules. So with this view, feminist ethics believes that in studying morality, there is a need to pay attention to vulnerabilities that result in some imbalance or asymmetry, such as these concepts indicated in the slide: subjugation of women, sexism, male dominance, patriarchy, systemic misogyny rather, and of course the oppression of women. Now, furthermore, if feminism is about gender, and gender is the name for a social system that distributes power unequally among men, gender queer people, trans, and also intersex people, and including women, of course, then you would expect that feminist ethicists would try to understand, to criticize, and to correct how gender operates within our moral and social beliefs and practices. So this is one thing that is very unique and important, an important contribution of feminist ethics in moral philosophy. In the first place, feminist ethics challenges on moral grounds the powers men have over women, and it claims for women, again, on moral grounds, the powers that gender denies them. So this is the central task for feminist ethics. And this is also the same way the feminist philosopher Sarah Clark Miller, mentioned earlier, considers as the primary task or aim of feminist ethics. She says that feminist ethics figures out previous historical feminist ethics inadequacies, or rather the works of earlier ethics experts or ethicists would be considered inadequacies. So for Miller, she would describe two overarching aims of feminist ethics, and she calls these critical and creative endeavors of feminist ethics. So before I go to the two aims according to Miller, let me just talk about a couple of caveats she also expounds in her paper with the title Feminist Ethics. So number one is that when we talk about feminist ethics in the same way as we talk about feminism, we're not trying to bash males, or we're not trying to exclude male in the discussion. We're actually proposing or putting forward the possibility of reciprocal recognition, or the invitation to the genuine commitment to ending the oppression of women as a task of both men and women. So the first caveat is that feminist ethics takes as its subject matter the oppression of women, and it does not take a principled negative stance toward men. Right. The second caveat is that the focus for ethicists, this variety, is not feminine ethics, okay, but rather feminist ethics. And feminist ethics is more encompassing. All right. The distinction is very important. While some feminist ethicists do find moral significance in practices that historically have been labeled feminine, for example, caring for the young and elderly, feminist ethics covers more territory. That's why I said it's more encompassing in terms of its scope. Okay, now let's go to the critical aim of feminist ethics. One primary aim of feminist ethics is to criticize earlier ethical theories for a host of inadequacies, is what I said earlier. This could span from the overt or the obvious to the covert or the subtle inadequacies. Throughout the history of ethics, philosophers have offered treatises and systems with a lot of biases and unfounded assumptions, one of which, or a couple of which, would be those that I've mentioned about Immanuel Kant's articulation against women. So feminist ethics comes in and pushes the boundaries of what really counts as a proper subject matter in ethics. Furthermore, it explores issues and themes, as what I said earlier, particularly on areas of vulnerabilities, domestic violence, sex work, and child rearing. These are things or matters or concepts that are not looked into in previous traditional theories. So another critical aim of feminist ethics is its consideration of challenging the common focus of traditional theories, which are rationality, independence, and autonomy. For feminist ethics, it challenges these concepts as applied to ethics, such that feminist ethicists would believe that there should be consideration on emotionality rather than rationality. There should be consideration of interdependence instead of independence, and of course, relationality instead of autonomy. So this is the critical endeavor of feminist ethics. Now, taking off from this critical aim, the creative aim would explore on what could possibly be done out of this criticism. So in criticizing the gender inadequacies of moral theory, this is seen to be useful in being able to determine how mainstream moral theories do not properly perceive or cannot perceive and sometimes do not even care to perceive gender oppression. So what Miller puts forward here is the creative aim of feminist ethics. For without creative endeavors to generate positive ethical theories that can make up for the shortcomings of other moral philosophies, then feminists would be left without an ethical rudder. That's what Miller said. So according to this creative aim, we need creative endeavors to turn from the criticisms and generate positive critical theories or activities or initiatives that can provide guidance on how to be moral in the world that considers feminist perspectives. Okay, so those are the two overarching aims of feminist ethics as put forward by Sarah Clark Miller. Now let's go to the themes of feminist ethics. The themes of feminist ethics would be oppression, vulnerability, independence, and they're intentionally put together. The third being relationality, and the fourth, non-ideal theory. Each of these themes responds to criticism of standard concepts and approaches in mainstream ethical theory. So we're going to look into these themes shortly and discuss some relevant or peripheral discussions of other feminist philosophers about these concepts. Now, again, feminist ethics begins with an analysis of oppression, particularly on sexist oppression. So this is a concept that has really been the subject of traditional philosophy, as has been emphasized quite often. So if you talk about the theories of ethics, we would, as what I said, almost always refer to the big three theories. So the theories I've mentioned, virtue ethics, the ontology, and utilitarianism, whose perspectives are very limited to limited analysis on the systems of oppression. Of course, we could cite one work that has touched into the consideration of the situation of women, and that is the work of John Stuart Mill. In the book, The Subjection, or in the essay, The Subjection of Women, Mill argues in favor of legal and social equality between men and women. But other than that work, the rest of the work of philosophers would talk about their positions on various concepts, and very limited analysis, if at all there is an analysis of oppression, very limited analysis of systems of oppression. Why is this the case? We can speculate that maybe because male philosophers have have not been subjected to oppression, so they have no experience to back on, as opposed to women who can talk about their narratives or encounters of oppression. So this could be one speculation, and there could be others you may want to also explore thinking about. So oppression, is what I said, is the central theme of feminist ethics. And according to American political philosopher and feminist Iris Marion Young, there are actually 5 phases of oppression, or 5 types of oppression. She mentions violence as one of them. Another is exploitation. There's also marginalization, powerlessness, and cultural imperialism. So let's begin with violence. And this is probably the most overt or most obvious and visible form of oppression, which women and even vulnerable groups still have to deal with until the present time. So members of some groups live with the knowledge that they must fear random, unprovoked attacks on their persons or property, and these attacks do not necessarily need a motive, but are intended to damage, humiliate, or destroy the person. Violence, one of the most visible forms of oppression. The second is exploitation, and this is the act of using people's labors to produce profit while not compensating them fairly. And people who work in, for example, in an enslaving environment would be example of exploited individuals. The third, according to Iris Marion Young, is marginalization, and this is the act of relegating or confining a group of people to a lower social standing or to outer limit or edge of society. So they're being sidelined if they're being marginalized. Overall, marginalization, according to Iris Marion Young, is a process of exclusion, and we can mention marginalization based on sex or on race or on ethnicity as some examples of marginalization. The fourth is the idea of powerlessness, which is linked with Marxist theory of socialism. So in the theory of socialism, some people have power while others have not. And the powerlessness are dominated by the ruling class or the proletariat, and are situated to take orders and rarely have the right to give them. So some of the fundamental injustices associated with powerlessness are inhibition to develop one's capacities, so limiting one's capacities, lack of decision-making power, and exposure to disrespectful treatment because of the lowered status. Okay, and then finally, we have cultural imperialism, which involves taking the culture of the ruling class, and establishing it as the standard or the norm. So the groups that have the power in society control how the people in the society interpret and communicate. Therefore, the beliefs of that society are the most widely disseminated and express the experience, values, goals, and achievements of these groups. I can think of patriarchy as I discuss about the meaning of cultural imperialism to be an example. Now, all of these are phases of oppression, and unfortunately, through the years, women have been locked into different stereotypes, different phases of oppression that promote inequality in many aspects. Okay. And feminist ethical interest in oppression arises from a critique of patriarchal ways of doing ethics. Because in such kind of approach, it fails to detect or take interest in the oppressive conditions of the vulnerable groups. Okay, now let's go to the second theme, which is vulnerability and dependence. When we say vulnerability, this can be described as one's susceptibility to harm. Independence would be reliance to others, so simple description of the two concepts to put things in proper context. So this second theme, they're, as what I said earlier, intentionally put together because they have conceptual intertwining. So when we talk about traditional forms of ethics, we can usually describe the individual that is being molded in this kinds of perspective of doing ethics to be an idealized version of humanity, one that is fully rational, one who's independent and free from harm. Okay, so that's traditional ethics. And traditional ethics is tended to understand human beings as somewhat, not susceptible to vulnerability or impervious to vulnerability. But what is the reality? We all know that the reality is that we are susceptible to damage and diseases, right? And that we are vulnerable to harmful actions of others. And once we're injured or once we're harmed, we are dependent upon others for support. That is the reality. So what Sarah Clark Miller is trying to say is that humans, to support vulnerability and dependency, humans are born in a radical state of dependency that necessitates a caring response to their needs for the entirety of their lives. So we recognize vulnerability and we recognize dependence such that in dependence, we acknowledge the significance of interdependence. Okay, so that is for vulnerability and dependency. Now, the third theme is relationality, which can also help us to reconsider issues in mainstream ethics, in need for further feminist treatment. So, for example, we can talk about the feminist treatment of friendship, of love, partiality versus impartiality, and of course, special obligations, and patterns of moral reasoning that incorporate partiality and particularity. So these are some ways to do a feminist ethics perspective of moral situation or moral concepts. Okay, so for example, if we consider relationality or if we consider the themes of feminist ethics, we may also want to explore on the questions. For example, what does a specifically feminist kind of friendship look like, or when is love ethical and when is it oppressive? So going beyond the level of understanding these concepts in the traditional sense that disregard, relationality and the other themes of feminist ethics. Finally, we have non-idealism. And non-ideal, I would understand, is to be non-mainstream. So non-ideal is in some way, and this theme would be the amalgamation or the combination of the three themes I've earlier mentioned. When feminists criticize ethical theories for viewing humanity as predominantly independent or autonomous, when they are criticizing, what they are criticizing rather is that ideal nature of those or these ethical theories. So in other words, what we're saying is that traditional ethical theories are so ideal that they're not grounded on what's actually happening in reality. This is something that feminist ethics challenges as well. So in looking at non-ideal theory, we can begin to perceive things or ethical situations differently. We're able to engage the concepts and norms that we take to be natural through self-reflexive critic, revealing the ways in which concepts that appear to have the status of natural law are instead carefully maintained socially dominant notions that result in the systematic privileging of a few at the expense of the well-being of many. All right, so we, in other words, feminist ethics overall tries to contribute a perspective that considers the feminist lens, okay, the feminist perspective, again, looking into some vulnerabilities that have been sidelined for so many centuries. So the non-ideal theory and the concepts that this theory provides may give our moral perception, a more serious and a more inclusive boost. And these are areas that feminist ethics magnify on toward having, as what I said, a feminist lens on ethical situations. So we've talked about the themes of feminist ethics, again, oppression, vulnerability, independency, relationality, and non-ideal theory. All right, now for the last part, I'm going to talk about the salient points of some varieties of feminist ethics. So I'd like to begin with the classic illustration of the theory of moral development of Lawrence Kohlberg. So the title is Heinz's Dilemma. Heinz's wife was dying because of a special kind of cancer. There was only one medicine that the doctors thought might cure her, but it was an advanced formula that a pharmaceutical company had recently discovered. This drug was extremely costly to produce due to the high-cost equipment and singular production techniques. On top of that, the company was selling the drug at a price tenfold the production costs. Heinz went to everyone he knew to borrow money, but he could only collect half of what the drug costs. He sought an audience with the CEO of the pharmaceutical company, told him that his wife was dying, and begged him to sell the drug cheaper or allowed him to defer the payment, but the CEO refused. He couldn't make any exception as they had spent massive funds in the research and equipment, and turning in a profit was the top priority for the company. Heinz was devastated and at wit's end about what he should do next. In the end, he broke into the company and stole the drug for his wife. So this is where the theory of moral development of Lawrence Kohlberg drew inspiration from. So from which he developed the theory of moral development, where there are 3 levels of moral reasoning, and under each level there are 2 stages each. His conclusion is that children are moral beings. Now, what's wrong with Kohlberg's theory? Well, aside from its being androcentric, it's also being criticized for a very abstract hypothesis or unrealistic hypothesis. It can be noted that the respondents of Kohlberg here are young children, young male children, so of a certain age, if I'm not mistaken, 10 to 16 years old, who have not experienced being challenged with the situation Heinz faces, or being married, for example, or even being in a relationship. So there were some critics on such abstractness and inauthenticity of the results of the study of Kohlberg. But in Kohlberg's findings, boys, he said, consistently came out ahead of girls in their moral development. Now, Carol Gilligan, one of the students of Lawrence Kohlberg, or the mentees of Kohlberg, was curious and decided to investigate whether something other than girls' moral development or inferiority was afoot. Okay, so what Gilligan detected was that women and girls had a different moral voice. This inspired the title of her famous 1982 book, In a Different Voice. So this also turned out to be what we now call the care ethics, the relational approach to ethics. So in care ethics, it constitutes an ethical approach in terms of which involvement, harmonious relations, and the needs of others have to do in ethical decision making. And this is consistent with the main idea of feminist ethics. So it's basically responding against the ethics of justice, basically coming from the theory of moral development of her teacher. Whereas the ethics of justice constitutes an ethical perspective in terms of which ethical decisions are made on the basis of universal principles and rules, impartial, verifiable manner with a view to ensuring the fair and equitable treatment of all people. For ethics of care or care ethics, it constitutes an ethical approach in terms of which involvement, harmonious relations, and the needs of others play an important role or part in ethical decision making in each ethical situation. Now, building on the distinction between justice and care, within the feminist philosophy, there is a kind of ethics that begins from justice, from the perspective of justice, right? In fact, this viewpoint of feminist ethics finds justice at its very core. Okay, this is liberal feminism. So liberal feminism responds to the overarching matter of gender oppression. That is the focus of feminist ethics. And the intention is to seek equality between the genders and the sexes. Okay. Furthermore, liberal feminists propose equality between the genders in both the public and the private spheres as an antidote to gender oppression. So, what does equality between the genders and sexes in both public and private spheres mean? And how do we accomplish it? In the private sphere, liberal feminists promote the ethical importance of domestic partnerships and, of course, marriages. And these would be grounded on the ethical importance or on that which is genuinely equal, okay, not oppressive to one gender or not hierarchical, okay, especially in terms of how people divide the labor on running the household, so who's in charge of what chores or what responsibilities in the household. So liberal feminists demand equality in the public sphere as well. For example, they have this one specific example would be support for women's reproductive autonomy, like my body, my right. This could be one example of how liberal feminists would embrace personal and political autonomy. Okay, and then finally there's the transnational feminist ethics. There are three intersecting features of transnational feminist ethics, namely intersectionality, self-reflexive criticism, and activism. Okay, so this type of ethical feminist ethics is concerned with both similarities and differences in the forms of gender oppression that can take worldview. It's more encompassing in its scope, or it's more, vast in terms of its scope, that it considers intersectionality and the worldwide view. So transnational feminist ethicists argue that we cannot actually understand global gender oppression properly if there is no strong sense of intersectionality. Okay, that is, if there's absence of awareness of the ways in which gender oppression is interwoven with other forms of oppression. This can be related in one example I'll talk about later on. Okay, so those are just three varieties of feminist ethics, and there are more varieties. These are just some of them that may also be explored in further discussions. So these are just a few of the things that I have talked about: feminist ethics, care ethics rather. We have transnational ethics, and of course, liberal feminism. Okay, so in conclusion, I'd like to share a narrative of Marilyn Frye articulated in her 1989 work, The Politics of Reality, Essays in Feminist Theory. This is about a birdcage. So observe this birdcage. Consider a bird cage. If you look very closely at just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. If your conception of what is before you is determined by this myopic focus, you could look at that one wire up and down the length of it and unable to see why a bird would not just fly around the wire anytime it wanted to go somewhere. Furthermore, even if one day at a time you myopically inspected each wire, you still would not see why a bird would have trouble going past the wires to get anywhere. There is no physical property of any one wire, nothing that the closest scrutiny could discover, that will reveal how a bird could be inhibited or harmed by it, except in the most accidental way. It is only when you step back, stop looking at the wires one by one, microscopically, and take a macroscopic view of the whole cage that you can see why the bird does not go anywhere. And then you will see it in a moment. It will require no great subtlety of mental powers. It is perfectly obvious that the bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers, no one of which would be the least hindrance to its flight, but which, by their relations to each other, are as confining as the solid walls of a dungeon. So this is the bird cage analogy of Marilyn Wire, the systemic birdcage of sexism, she says. It is now possible to grasp one of the reasons why oppression, why vulnerability can be hard to see and recognize. One can study the elements of an oppressive structure with great care and goodwill without seeing the structure as a whole, and hence without seeing or being able to understand that one is looking at a cage and that there are people there who are caged, whose motion and mobility are restricted, whose lives are shaped and reduced. Can the systemic birdcage of oppression, of vulnerability, be resolved? As the cageness of the birdcage is a macroscopic phenomenon, the oppressiveness of the situations in which women live our various and different lives is a macroscopic phenomenon as well. Neither can be seen from a microscopic perspective, but when you look macroscopically, you can see it, a network of forces and barriers which are systematically related and which conspire to the mobilization, reduction, and molding of women and the lives that we live. So this is how Marilyn Fry would describe what she calls the systemic birdcage of sexism. And we can see that this kind of birdcage analogy or situation still can be felt and seen until the present time. So we see that there's something that needs to be done on a macroscopic level, as this is a macroscopic phenomenon. And while we acknowledge that there are some blind spots for the existing practices and perspectives, we put forward the fact that feminist ethics can function as a lens in seeing these moral situations. So feminist ethics helps us to perceive ethical situations and situations of vulnerability in a feminist lens, with a gender lens. And this will be a vaster and I would say even more expansive approach to moral situations. So you are encouraged to think further about feminist ethics and its importance to the current situation of the world. That's all for today. Thank you very much for listening. And this has been Dr. Gina Opiniano for the lecture Introduction to Feminist Ethics. Thank you.